You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 21st of July, 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Israel launches new ground assault on Gaza, but is it clear what for? Is India running out of friends in Southeast Asia? And boffins determine that holidays are good for people. Is this science, or do they just want more time off? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Isabel Hilton and Michael Binion will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the Cambridge University historian Erin O'Halloran about her new book East of Empire, recalling the nationalist movements which tried to redraw the Middle East and India on their own terms. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue and a visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute, and by Michael Binion, foreign affairs specialist for The Times. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Isabel, you have recently been discussing artificial intelligence and what it is going to do for, or indeed to us, with judges.
Yes, in fact, some judges who were already pretty worried about things like deep fake evidence and how can they tell, and a certain informality that has crept in since courts went virtual, and witnesses seem to think it quite appropriate to give evidence whilst in the bath. So lots of things to talk about.
Is that a thing you're still allowed to do? Presumably that would involve bringing your own bathtub to court.
No, you can still give evidence remotely. And in fact, this was quite an interesting discussion because there were some Chinese judges present. And they were saying that, there's, in order to make justice available to the masses, you might think there are separate issues around that. However, procedurally, in remote villages, it's quite useful to be able to give evidence remotely for poorer people who are a long way away from court. It's just that once people get online, they don't seem to take things quite as seriously as they should.
Is there not a problem as well with once people are online, the whole thing can be gamed fairly easily, in much the same way that students are increasingly, I think, going to be faced with being shoved back into freezing lecture halls to write essays by hand, so people can tell they're not winging it with ChatGPT? Isn't there a problem with remote evidence?
There may well be a problem with remote evidence, but since the testimony is in theory under oath and in theory oral, it's not so much an AI issue, but it is a question of how do you get people to take an institution seriously when they're remote from it and they're not subject to any of the kind of, dignity of the court. And that's a real problem. And balancing access or reasonable access. The other problem the British courts have is that there's a massive backlog. So using AI for certain procedures would clearly help. It would make it cheaper and faster. But there's a very serious discussion on how much you can allow that without AI, as it were, distorting the process. So there's the attraction of speed and lower costs versus the integrity of the system. It's pretty active right now as a discussion.
Those are all subjects we may come back to on a daily at a later date. But Michael, you have been concerning yourself in the Times with slipping standards in a different realm.
Yes, we sometimes do editorials that are not completely serious. And I've just written one about students who brew tea in the microwave.
Oh my God.
An abomination. I mean, is this how we survived the Blitz? How can you make tea that even tastes like anything when you put the tea bag and the milk in a mug of water and, zap it for a minute or so? It's just nothing like it. I mean, really, this
did you subject this to rigorous scientific testing? Did you attempt yourself to make tea in the microwave?
I'm afraid I haven't tried doing that. No,
you might be missing.
I should. I know.
This is just basic.
I know. What personal experience?
What kind of fact checking goes on at the time?
Do your editors not impose any standards at all? This is just
yes.
typical of the slipshod fabrications we expect of the mainstream media. Before you come back next time, Michael, I want you to make tea in the microwave.
All right, I'll try it
and find out what it's actually like. You might surprise yourself. I'm sure it's hideous. We will start, he said, with an absolutely barely audible grinding of gears in Gaza, where the Israel Defense Forces appear to be engaged in a major ground assault on the central Gazan city of Deir al-Balah, or whatever remains of it after 21 months of war. It is the first time the IDF has mounted substantial ground operations in Deir al-Balah since October 7th, 2023. It is not altogether clear what the purpose of this incursion is, though it is believed that some of the hostages still held by Hamas are somewhere in the vicinity. At the same time, 25 countries, including many who would normally count themselves among Israel's allies, e.g. the UK, Australia and almost all of the EU, have signed a letter condemning Israel's recent behaviour and urging an immediate end to the conflict. Michael, first of all, to this new ground operation, tanks rumbling towards Deir al-Balah, is it clear what the point of this is or what the purpose of it is at this point?
Absolutely unclear. It appears to be ostensibly in order to hunt down some Hamas commanders who are still fueling resistance and who still apparently are holding out militarily. But, I mean, that's really laughable. There is a lot of talk about this being political more than military, that the Netanyahu government is determined to keep the conflict going, because as long as the conflict is in progress, then there's no election, and without an election there's no chance that he will be overthrown, as seems likely if there's a vote tomorrow. And if he is overthrown, there's a likelihood he'll be put on trial for corruption. So Israelis have been saying this for some time. And Trump seems to be pretty annoyed about the continuing warfare, and he's made some pretty tough comments and more or less called Netanyahu out a few times, and I think his officials are increasingly furious at this. They're not saying things much in public, but they've been quoted separately and privately, saying that Netanyahu seems to be a madman.
Is he, at this point, Isabel, perhaps the chap in the proverb about somebody who only has a hammer and therefore thinks everything looks like a nail?
Well, I think that I agree with Michael that actually Netanyahu's purpose in all of this is to avoid going to jail for corruption, and he doesn't care how many conflicts he stirs up, how many people he kills. He has managed to keep the United States on board pretty much with the proposition of ethnic cleansing, driving the Palestinians out of even the rubble in which they are currently living. So we have this absolutely appalling spectacle of starving people being fired on with tank shells. It's unconscionable. But as long as it avoids any kind of challenge to him before the Israeli parliament goes into its summer break, he seems quite happy with this, and his long-term plan, or his longer-term plan, is to create effectively a concentration camp in which people can get food, but they can't get out unless they are shipped off to a third country. So it is an absolutely appalling plan that he is determined to carry through.
On that particular subject, Michael, part of the text of this letter says, and I quote, "We strongly oppose any steps towards territorial or demographic change in the occupied Palestinian territories," which is a warning to Israel to neither annex the territory, presumably, or force its population out. But are those countries which have signed this letter not making a bit of a bind for themselves here? Because do we not run the risk that when this war ends, as one day it will, there will be still 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, many of whom quite reasonably will want to go. Do we run the risk of ending up confining them to the ruins in order to make a point?
Well, of course, that's always a risk. The problem is that there are not many other countries willing to take them, partly because they see this as a plot to get rid of the Palestinians out of Gaza.
Which is not an unreasonable supposition.
Yes, well, you see, Egypt, which is right next to the Gaza Strip, could easily take quite a number of people, but they don't want them in Sinai, partly because they don't want them anyway. They feel that, they're not Egyptians, why should they come? And partly because they say that's just giving Netanyahu an easy way out and is surrendering to those expansionists who want to actually actually put Israeli settlers in the Gaza Strip. So, and Jordan also, for the same reason, is very worried about that. They don't like the way that people in the West Bank are being driven out in the same way by actions by settlers. So the neighbouring countries are pretty worried about it. I think the danger, of course, of the Europeans all signing these declarations about acknowledging a Palestinian state, it's symbolic. It's good symbolism. It won't actually affect Israeli policy, not one jot. The only country that really matters for Israel is, of course, the United States, and that's really what does matter. And if Netanyahu thinks that somebody is criticising him, unless he thinks it's Trump, he's not really going to listen.
The United States, it's important to make clear, Isabel, has not signed this letter. Neither has Germany, whose relationships with Israel are complicated by the obvious. But again, we're thinking in terms of a post-war scenario, and there's no sign of that coming about anytime soon. But when that time comes, as it eventually must, will Israel have done itself lasting diplomatic damage? Is this something that is going to make those countries which, for example, have signed this letter warier of dealing with Israel in future?
I think this has done Israel enormous diplomatic damage. I mean, Israel had, moral standing after the circumstances of its creation, after the Holocaust and so on. For many years, it got away with behaviour that was justified in terms of defending, the Israel's right to exist and so on. But this goes way beyond that, and I think that it has completely degraded Israel's moral standing in the eyes of certainly, actually, most of the world except the United States. And even in the United States, it was quite interesting, Mike Huckabee's reaction. He's the US ambassador to Israel, and there has been some very, very aggressive settler behaviour, as you know, on the West Bank, and they have been repeatedly attacking Christian villages, which doesn't go down very well with very powerful Christians like Mike Huckabee. So I think that even in sections of US opinion, this behaviour is doing lasting damage.
Well, to Pakistan now, which appears to be enduring the peculiar modern anxiety which comes of US President Donald Trump taking an interest in your nation. Though Trump has not, as of this broadcast, speculated about the possibility of the US annexing Balochistan, it is only lunchtime in Washington. Last month, President Trump hosted Pakistan's Chief of the Army Staff, Field Marshal Asim Munir, at the White House. It has now emerged that this prompted an official private harumph from India, and in possibly related developments that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi declined a recent invitation to visit DC himself. Isabel, first of all, is it odd that the President of the United States would host the Chief of Pakistan's Army Staff with no civilian officials present?
It's extremely unusual, and it's really not clear why this was done, and certainly it did annoy India, with which, I have to say, Donald Trump had hitherto appeared to be forming quite a good relationship. So it's all a rather puzzling exercise. And I find the idea that this is driving India into the arms of China faintly unconvincing, because, they have a long history of not getting on terribly well. And Pakistan has been one of China's ways of annoying India for a very long time. So, Pakistan could rely on China to encourage it to keep India, off balance, and that was, from their perspective, a very happy arrangement.
My own personal potted theory, Michael, President Trump obviously was anxious to claim credit for ending the recent exchange of unpleasantries between India and Pakistan. I think Pakistan promised to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize, although, again, to reiterate, that is not a big deal. Being nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, practically any clown can nominate anybody else. Is it possible?
In this case.
Well, indeed. But is it possible that he convened this lunch in order to do a bit of lobbying for himself?
Very possibly, and I think your theory is absolutely right. Donald Trump tends to react to grudges and grievances, and he was pretty miffed when he thought that he would get credit for ending the brief tit-for-tat after the Indians hit Pakistan with bombers after the terrorist action in India. And he thought that America had played a key role in stopping that developing any further. And the Indians rather played that down, said, no, that's nothing to do with it, really. We both agreed together. And he thought, well, I'm not getting credit for something I did, and I should be. And therefore he invited the Pakistan army chief. Now, in terms of practical politics, that's the right man to invite, because basically Pakistan is run by the army, and the army chief is the most important political figure there. But in terms of protocol and also diplomacy, it's not really the right person. I mean, it should be the Prime Minister of Pakistan who would go to Washington to talk to the United States President. But, I mean, his motives, you never quite know what they are. And whether this will backfire, I don't know. I mean, certainly India's rather annoyed about it, and they feel that things are cooling that way. Also, Trump, of course, has suggested, or others have suggested, that if Putin continues to annoy him about Ukraine, he might put sanctions on those countries that are buying oil from Russia. And one of them, of course, is India, and they buy a large amount of Russian oil. And if Trump was to apply further sanctions, he's already applied a number of sanctions that have really upset India. So the row about all that is also, I think, provoking a lot of cooling of relations between the two.
Isabel, aside from curiosity, what would have been Field Marshal Minir's reason for accepting the invitation? I mean, is it imaginable that Pakistan could start to think that maybe the US is going to be more useful to us than China?
Well, I think not more useful than China, but if you go back to Russia's invasion of Afghanistan and the wars that then followed, Pakistan was a very close ally of the United States. But historically, it's also been a close ally of China. And since you can't change geography, that's likely to remain the case. But the Pakistanis felt very let down in the later stages of the US engagement in Afghanistan because they had supported the Taliban, for example. They were pretty much protégés of the Pakistani military and the Pakistani intelligence services. And there was a parting of the ways which certainly left the after the attack on Afghanistan and the first overthrow of the Taliban. The Pakistani military were very alienated from the United States and felt that their interests no longer coincided. Now, they're always open to a kind of slight realignment, but I don't think it's a fundamental shift. It's really unlikely to be.
Is there a new great game afoot here, Michael? Are China and India competing for influence now in countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, the Maldives, etc.?
Well, they've been doing that for years, yes. And I mean, particularly the Indians are very worried about the Chinese setting up what they call a string of pearls. I think is that the technical term, meaning sort of bases all around the Indian Ocean where they can have their navy call in and they can sort of exert influence. And that's been always a worry. And I think, going right back over the border conflicts that they've had with China, I mean, this goes back a long way. Not every so often there's an attempt at sort of better and warmer relations, and one visits the other, or, they send senior officials or foreign ministers or something to each other's countries, but there's not really a warming there. And the other thing is that India is now in a more vulnerable position in that they don't have the solid relationship they once had with Russia. They're still quite close to Russia, but in the Soviet times there was a real treaty of friendship, and therefore India was seen more in the neutral or even Soviet camp by the Americans. Since the fall of communism, the Americans have got closer to India, particularly militarily and in terms of science and cooperation and technology and all sorts of things. But that seems to have come to a bit of a halt, and it's not going very much further. So one wonders where Modi's going to go. One place he is going to go is London, and he's coming to London very soon, in fact, the day after tomorrow. And that is a great triumph for Britain. Well, it's a triumph for Keir Starmer because he is at last signing a long-hoped-for trade treaty, which, I mean, it's not vital for British trade, but it's certainly going to be a big boost. And maybe British-Indian relations will warm up a bit just now.
I think India is also feeling pretty surrounded by China, and particularly if you look at relations with Nepal. There's a long land border there. It's very open in the north of India, and for decades, centuries, it was pretty much under Indian control because it was a Hindu kingdom, and also because all major supplies had to pass through India, so the screws could always be tightened. But since the Maoist took over in Nepal, it has completely turned to becoming a Chinese puppet, and India's rather let it happen.
Certainly.
Well, to Greece now, which may well rival Ireland for the country with the greatest disparity between its global impact and the size of its population. Greece has an incalculable soft power footprint and considerable economic heft. It controls about 20% of the world's cargo fleet and a population barely bigger than London. Many Greeks, perhaps 600,000, an entire Athens or 2 Thessalonikis, left during the recurrent economic crises of recent years, and now Greece wants them back. The country's Labour Minister, Nikki Kerameos, is touring Europe with Greek employers to persuade them that things back home have improved, and is presumably reminding them about the food. Michael, is this a reasonable thing for a country to be doing, to try and get its diaspora back home?
Absolutely reasonable, very sensible, and of course particularly as those that left were those that the country could least afford to lose.
This is usually the way.
Yes, they were the educated, they were those who were mobile, who could find jobs elsewhere, and they were slightly better off than others. I mean, they would have contributed, or should have contributed, a lot to Greece's recovery, which has been a remarkable recovery from a really, really deep dip. I mean, Greece was practically bankrupt, almost on the brink of being expelled from the EU at the time of their economic crisis, and not surprisingly, those that could get out, very many of them did. And also, not surprisingly, a lot of them are now feeling a bit homesick. And to get them back is a sensible move by the government. It will have to offer some pretty good incentives. It's offering tax breaks, 50% income tax reduction for 7 years is one idea. But wages are still low. The only thing they can offer is the good life back home, family ties, and 30% say they miss the warm weather.
I mean, there would be a lot to miss about Greece once you'd left it. It is a delightful place to visit, certainly. But on the subject of the tax breaks there, Isabel, which, as Michael points out, that's 50% off your income tax for 7 years if you've been away longer than 5 years and you come back. Is that going to be an easy sell to people who stayed in Greece? I can see them getting somewhat miffed.
Oh, I guess the yes, I quite agree that would set up some resentment, and perhaps it would precipitate a second wave of emigration in order to benefit from the golden hello. I guess the other thing, the other aspect of this is that given that most European economies actually need more Labour, at the same time they are very anti-immigration for political reasons, that this is perhaps a compromise that might answer both problems. But I think it's
funnily enough, for one reason or another, you don't see angry people out in the streets complaining that there are too many Greeks.
This is true. But you might say we can bribe all our Greek citizens to come back, and that will spare you having to put up with people from elsewhere, which could be a message packaged for a population that doesn't want immigration.
You see, Greeks tend to go to places that are actually quite welcoming. I mean, a lot go to America, Australia.
A great many
to Australia, yes, and have done pretty well there.
They have,
and therefore they're seen as people who bring things that are needed. They contribute. They're usually pretty well educated, and that's what Australians would be, and others would be happy to welcome. So, as Isabel says, they don't cause great resentment when they go abroad. And 600,000, well, I suppose that's a fair number, but it's not mass emigration in the sense that other people are worried about being swamped by huge numbers.
Indeed not. Bulgaria is doing something similar, Isabel. They are, of course, also running up against the problem that wages in Bulgaria are not what
too low,
are still too low. But is this something that we are likely to see, do you think, poorer European countries doing, like realising that one of their greatest assets, i.e. those people, and as Michael says, it tends to be younger people, better educated people who had a few quid in the bank to start with.
And people who might also bring back some skills that they wouldn't have learned in their home territory. I think it's very much worthwhile if you can persuade them to come home. I mean, on a bigger scale, China's been doing this. China has been trying to get back, particularly people who'd moved to the United States, educated in the United States, in Silicon Valley, people who have technical skills, and they're being offered in lavish incentives to come back, labs of their own, lots of money, and that's having some success, not least because the atmosphere in the US has become hostile. For nationals of countries who are not that unwelcome, although I wouldn't count on being welcome in the United States, whoever you are at the moment, I think you're all slightly at risk. That might help. But yeah, I think if you can get people to come back, it's obviously a bonus.
Well, too conclusive scientific proof that holidays are relaxing. According to findings published by Boffins in the Journal of Applied Psychology, taking some time off does soothe both mind and body, but it has to be done properly, i.e. by ignoring emails from your bosses and refusing to communicate with colleagues, though it is far, far more satisfying to do that at work. It further says here that it is better for you to do something active while on holiday rather than spending it reading Dick Francis novels prone on a sun lounger attached to a cocktail with a twirly straw and an umbrella in it, which again, much more fun at work. Michael, does this strike you, as so many of these reports often do, as the learnings of the Institute of the Bleeding Obvious?
I think this is profound research. I think it's extremely sensible. It's also... yes.
I just genuinely hope the people who did this report got paid to test the veracity of their findings, much as you failed to do
with
microwaving
the tea.
Yes. I hope they managed to get paid to take a month in the Caribbean.
Take a good holiday and enjoy.
To see how that felt.
Yes. Actually, funnily enough, one of the things that people need to do now is make people take holidays, because top firms have discovered a rather clever wheeze of getting people to stay at the desk all year round by simply telling them, you don't have any set holidays. You can take as much as you would like.
That's incredibly passive-aggressive, isn't it?
Very much so, because then almost nobody feels they dare do it, because they feel, I'll be, not at the desk. It's sort of, it's a thing you can see happening, of course, in Japan, where people don't even like to go home at night. But in sort of Western society, holidays are meant to be sacrosanct. And if you say, well, of course, you can take as much as you like, then you find that they're only taking the odd day or here or there because they are worried that their colleagues are going to have to cover for them and they'll be held responsible. And everybody needs to get a break, and you can take it at any time of the year when you want. It's nice if you can stagger it, because then you don't have everybody crowding the beaches in August. But of course, if you want to take your holiday in February, well, it's not quite so attractive.
It is if you take it in Australia.
Well then, yes.
Lovely
I forgot.
That time of year.
Southern Hemisphere.
Slight counterpoint, though, Isabel, and this is something I have noticed possibly more among journalists as a profession than others, and I do not exclude myself from this, is that we're not very good at taking holidays. We get a bit discombobulated by being in a foreign place with actually nothing to do.
I suffered from that myself. If I was in a foreign place, I used to get very anxious that I wasn't immediately calling the Ministry of Inland Security or whatever. What was I doing there? And so, it's really hard to unwind. My sort of counter offer for this research is from many years ago, when I was working on the Sunday Times, and the Foreign Desk Secretary took a 2-week holiday, and we were eagerly awaiting her return when her mother rang up and said she was suffering from post-holiday depression, so she wouldn't be in for another week. So I think, there could be a mixed bag, this holiday business.
Perfect. I think the answer is to take lots of little short holidays. Mind you, if you have, school-aged children, that's not possible at all. But when you get the luxury of, being beyond having to worry about school-aged kids, I've taken, several little mini holidays. Great fun. One to Venice, one to Vienna, one to Lisbon, and I'm thinking of a holiday in Trieste. I've never been there.
I'm sure it's
3 or 4 days out. The big voyage that I've done already 7 times, which I think I possibly might do again, is to St. Helena. But it's
that really is getting away from
that is getting
just ask Napoleon.
Exactly.
But on that subject, Michael, and again, this is when we prevail upon the wisdom of your years. Was this easier back before modern communications were invented, or did your editors at the time find ways of getting to you via, I don't know, carrier pigeon or messenger with a cleft stick?
They could get to you. They didn't try to get you all the time, and they certainly couldn't get you on the mobile, but they always wanted, if possible, to have a phone number where they could contact you. They didn't expect you to call in, but usually, I mean, most people were sort of a bit twitchy and sort of just occasionally kept, everything all right? Not worried about anything. So I sort of had a rough idea of what was going on. Well, you have to keep up with the news anyway, so when you come back, you're not just, bleary-eyed and not knowing what's going on. But yes, certainly before mobiles, it was much easier to get away, and you didn't get bombarded with messages day and night.
Was that better or worse, though?
Well, I don't mind.
Did you not get worried about what you were missing out on, or what might be stacked up and waiting on your return?
A bit, but you can come back in a day. You quickly sort of think, well, what's been happening? Oh, the Queen died. Oh, gosh, yes.
I can imagine you sitting on a beach in St. Helena with your little shortwave radio, tuning into the BBC World Service. Yes. Just to be sure.
Yes, is anyone coming to fetch Napoleon's body back? Oh, they've done that, yes. You could be really isolated, and people who are, I don't know whether they're better off or not. I think for journalists to feel really isolated is a bit, as you say, discombobulating. You really do feel, gosh, I don't know what's happening, I don't feel comfortable.
I mean, Isabel, we have learned of Michael's possible holiday plans back to St. Helena. Just in closing, do you have any imminent plans?
Well, I have just been sailing in the Outer Hebrides, which was a pretty good getaway.
Okay, that sounds
and I'm going to Mid-Argyll in August, as I always do.
Go to St Kilda? I'd love to go there.
I've never... we've tried twice. It is a very long way, and actually it's become a bit of a hot spot for, expensive yachts who like to brag that they've gone to St Kilda. So I'm afraid the magic may have gone.
See, that's a strange cultural jarring, because if you come from where I come from, i.e. Australia, St Kilda are just a terrible, terrible football team. Isabel Hilton, Michael Binion, thanks for joining us. Profound apologies to any Saints fans who may be tuning in, but tell me I'm wrong. Finally, on today's show, it is self-evidently the case that portions of our world remain troubled by the ramifications of the partitions of the Middle East following World War I and of India following World War II. Possibly because the consequences have been so consuming, comparatively little attention has been paid to the build-up. East of Empire, a new book by Cambridge University historian Dr. Erin O'Halloran, seeks to rectify that by focusing on the interwar years, when anti-colonial and/or nationalist movements in Egypt and India coalesced, collaborated and competed. I spoke to Erin earlier and began by asking whether there was an effort at the time to forge an East as a sort of analogue of what we think of as the West.
I use the East as a very broad umbrella term, mirroring what I found in the archives themselves, mirroring how people who were engaged in these projects seemed to think of what they were doing. And so that means that they tended to use it in a really broad and nebulous way. It definitely had fuzzy edges, and depending on who you spoke to, or which memoir or which literary treatise you're consulting, the borders are slightly different, or the bounds of the East are different. Some conceptions are very straightforwardly focused on the East as something that is opposed to the West. Others seem to take the East as something that can borrow from the West, that can be in dialogue with the West, in the same way that we would think of, let's say, a Western conception of like universal human rights or something, as something that has space for the East within it. They have a conception of the East that is similarly universal and similarly kind of all-embracing. So I was really fascinated by all of the different contours or projects that seem to fit within this umbrella term of the East. And that's one of the things that I'm tracing, is at what points is the East very broad? At what points is it a big tent? And at what points does it start to narrow and fragment into different camps?
Was there a sense, though, in which they felt like they were actually working together?
They definitely were working together, certainly on some projects. The most obvious that I can list is the Defense of Palestine campaign that emerges in the late 1930s. That's something that a broad cross-section of Easternists, both anti-colonial nationalists, but also surrealist artists, feminists, pan-Islamists, are all involved in. And it draws a lot of Indian interest, both from the Congress party, like Gandhi and Nehru's party, and from the Muslim League that was Congress's main domestic rival. A lot of interest in what's going on in the Middle East and how they can support the anti-colonial politics of Palestine at that time. And it also draws in, as I try to illustrate, a lot of women who are mobilized around the, Arab nationalist cause, but also the cause of women's emancipation. And they become major spokespeople for the Palestinians as well.
I wanted to pick up on that chapter about the feminists in particular, because the book ends up being, I guess, inevitably, as probably any history does, a lot of signposts down roads that were never quite entirely travelled. And again, that's a really startling moment in the book, that there is this huge feminist impulse behind these decolonisation movements. Is there a particular point in both the Indian and the Middle Eastern context at which that did end up getting sort of shunted and not being as big a thing as one might have preferred it to have been?
The thing is that at the moment that decolonization actually takes place, it is accompanied, at least in the South Asian context, by women's emancipation to a broad degree. Women get the right to vote. They stand as ministers, they're governors. So that's already sort of taking place in the South Asian context, both in India and in Pakistan after 1947. In the Middle East, as I sort of argue in my epilogue, I see it as, a moment that even in Nasser's Egypt in the 50s, there is still an enormous amount of kind of impetus or momentum behind women's emancipation. What happens in the Arab East is a slow erosion of women's rights over the course of the 60s, 70s, 80s as a result of the failure of the secular nationalist projects to deliver on the kind of future that Arabs are imagining for themselves in the period that I'm writing about. And what replaces the secular nationalist movement, this we see it across the Levant, but in other parts of the region as well, and also in North Africa, is increasingly Islamist impulses, and this is where the erosion of women's rights comes from. So in a sense, if you look back at not just the archival documents, but like the films, the radio recordings, the speeches that we have from the 40s and 50s and 60s, I think you'll see that, there's an enormous amount of energy in women's liberation in the region. And this is not terribly controversial within the secular context that nationalist politics are taking place in at that time.
I know when you're looking at the way that various histories might have turned out, World War II is quite a big thing to take off the table. But it does sort of form the bookend of your narrative. It does end up being pretty much the end of the British Empire, which was the empire in play in these decolonisation processes. But does the nature of the way that it brought matters to a head, does that have an effect on what happens next, i.e. those two partitions?
100%. I think, as historians, we're really cautioned against playing too much with counterfactuals. They can be very bad for your health as a historian. But I have been asked when presenting the book in various contexts, does partition happen without World War II? It's an enormous question, and my honest answer is that I find it very difficult to see how you get to partition without the cataclysm of World War II, without the Holocaust in the case of Israel-Palestine, and in the case of India, without the kind of existential crisis of the Japanese lightning invasion of the whole of Southeast Asia, the Japanese army on the borders of India, and where that pushes the British to in terms of their repression and their cracking down on the Indian nationalist movement, throwing all of the Congress leaders in jail, etc. This creates a context within which Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the leader of the Muslim League, is essentially unopposed. He doesn't have his rivals sort of pushing back against all of the cases or the arguments that he's making in favor of Pakistan. And this creates a groundswell of support for a separate Muslim national home to be carved out of the Indian subcontinent, which I really don't think, without the specific context of World War II, it gets anywhere like the momentum behind it that it happens to.
That was Dr. Erin O'Halloran. Her new book, East of Empire, is available now and much recommended. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Isabel Hilton and Michael Binion. The show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Henry King. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.